Okay, okay, it seems to be working. Hello everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying their day. And I also hope you're all very excited for the Nordic Game Jam 2025. I hope you have a lot of fun. I want to say first thank you to the organization team for inviting me to speak and also for allowing me to come back to Copenhagen. I've lived in this city before, love it. So yeah, pretty good honor. So today I'm here to talk about how to make your game jam stand out. And really, at the end of it, it will be just simple tricks to bring more eyes and attention to your game. And I'll explain why I think that is important. So first, let me start by introducing myself. My name is André Cardoso. I'm originally from Brazil, and I'm a game developer and founder of Mix and Jam. So Mix and Jam, as mentioned, is a YouTube channel which I recreate game mechanics as a way to practice my game development skills. But also, I use this as a learning resource to the community. So a natural consequence of dissecting these popular and commercial games is that I also end up learning a lot about what makes these experiences so special and what makes them stand out. So my idea here is to share a little bit of that knowledge that I found along the way so that I can share it with you and that you can use this to improve your game jam experience a little bit. Now, I know I'm talking a lot about improving and making your game stand out, but we do have to remember we're in a game jam, so I need to clarify something. Your game does not need to stand out, right? We are in a game jam, and after all, game jams are a space for learning and having fun. So at the end of the day, you don't even have to deliver a game if you don't want to. The idea is that, of course, you have fun. But that being said, it is a great idea to make your game stand out. And I'll explain a little bit why I think that you should pay attention to it. Number one, obviously, is the amount of players. When you make your game stand out, when it brings more attention, you get more players. And it's not about the numbers, but really, if you're aiming to become a better game developer and a better game designer, the idea that with more players, you get more feedback about what you're doing. And hopefully you'll be participating on a lot of game jams and you're building your own games on itch or whatever. So more players playing your game mean that you will know what are you doing correct and what you're doing wrong. So of course, putting a little bit more effort into your game's attention and making it more shiny will mean more players equals more feedback. The second reason is if you put a little bit of that time to make your game stand out, you almost go out of here with a portfolio piece because you're dedicating a weekend or even more or less. You're putting all this time in, so you might as well have something that you're almost just ready to put it on your portfolio, and you'll be very proud of it. And very important is that by doing this and by dedicating this time is that you'll be learning and practicing an essential skill. So when we talk beyond the gameplay and beyond the basic simulation, presentation is actually an extremely important layer of games because that's what makes games be consumed by players. They look at it and they want to interact with it, so they need to stand out. So by putting a little bit more effort into your game's presentation, you will be developing an essential skill. Now, we are in a game jam. So I know I'm talking here a lot about, hey, let's put a little bit more attention. But I also want to be realistic because there's not a lot of time. So that being said again, do not overthink presentation. What we're trying to find here is a middle ground between let's put a little bit more attention, but let's also not overdo it, right? Because again, we need to be realistic. So we're talking about here about techniques that we're going to use that are somewhat realistic. So what kind of techniques do we need to improve and make our game stand out, but also being realistic? We need things that are easy to implement, quick to iterate, somewhat modular, and that can give you good results, right? So let's categorize the tips that I'm going to bring here on this specific talk. So number one, and I think is honestly one of the most important ones, is easing curves. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about hierarchy, which is a very common element in most game engines. I'm going to talk a little bit about lighting and how you should pay attention a little bit to it because of the defaults of every game engine. I'm going to talk about events, which is a neat thing that will help you get to a point of improving your game's presentation along the run of the jam. And then I'm going to kind of wrap it up by talking a little bit about the identity or the brand of your game. So first off, easing curves. Now, for those of you not familiar with like the concept of easing curves, and I'm sure a lot of you are, but easing curve is like essentially the curve that determines how your animation looks from point A to point B. So this is an example of an out-back curve. And as you can see, the idea is that the curve is determining what happens in between those 2 points. Hence why a lot of the tools that are responsible for helping you with these kind of easing curves are called tweeners, because you get you're doing the in-between. So in this case, the out-back, you see that you're taking the position on the origin and you're going to the target, but you're going a little bit beyond the target. So you can see it goes beyond and then only to go back a little bit to the target. So that is an example of one easing curve. You have here the example also of the in and out back, which does the same motion but for both positions. And then another example here is the spring animation. So again, same concept that you're going from point A to B and you're just using a curve to represent how do you want that to look. Now, for those of you using Unity, there is a tool and a plugin that is free, and I cannot recommend this tool enough because it's something I use for every project. It's free, as I said, and is absolutely powerful, which is Dween. Not sponsored. But I think that everyone using Unity should be using Dween because I take it for granted, and sometimes I talk to people, and some people are like, I never heard about this before. And I'm like, what? Like you should definitely be looking about it. But anyways, and for those of you using other engines, Godot has an implemented built-in easing solution. Unreal, God knows, I don't know how do you do that in Unreal. I guess lerp everything, I don't know. But that's just to say that specifically with Unity, which is something I've have more experience, you should definitely be looking at Dween for this. So here's an example. Let's say that your game logic, very simple and boring. You're clicking on these spheres to make them grow or shrink. And right now, this is set to a linear animation. That's it, pretty basic. You're just like expanding to scale number 2 and then going back to 1. Specifically with Dween, changing this is as easy as setting an ease type of curve. So let's say, for example, that I change this to an outbounds. And you can see now how this kind of like animation looks. And this feels a lot better because there's a lot more responsiveness to what you're doing. And this improves game feel. And I know that people take game feel as this thing about making your game look good and making your game somewhat visually interesting. But game feel is not really about that. Game feel is about providing more feedback. So when changing animation curves, really what you're doing is that you're adding more reaction to your action. So that feels good as a player. The little input I did, a mouse click, gives me more interesting visual results. So simple easing curves improve experience. And because a lot of Game Jam games end up being based on mouse interactions, this is also a great idea for you to think about when you're doing interactions with mouse, with UI, or you're selecting the characters in your screen, or anything that you're doing. Because since you are interacting with mouse, a simple way to improve the game feel and the feedback in which the players are getting is to add tweenings for scaling or for rotating. You can do so many things. And there are many examples of the types of curves that are usually included in these tweening tools, such as Dween. And we're thinking right now about transformation, right? Position, scale, but literally you can tween absolutely everything. You can tween color, you can tween transparency, you can even tween custom properties from a shader, for example. So the possibilities are endless, really. But if you really need to be convinced that you should be using tweening or easing curves, there's a game you might have heard of that honestly feels like it's 90% easing curves. And it's a game that's like not really addictive at all. Super chill. Like, I don't think you should be worried about this game. Try it out. I don't know. But as you can see, like, a lot of what Balatro does is because the sort of like logic of the game is pretty simple, it has to sort of like go beyond in terms of how it feels. And a great way to make your game feel better is to add more reaction to the actions that you're taking in the game. So shuffling your cards, selecting them, playing them, everything you'll see. If you start thinking about it, you'll see that Balatro has a lot of these examples. In the channel, Mix and Jam, I've actually taken a look into a little bit of exploring that. So, of course, going out from here, if you want to just have a better idea about how Balatro is using this kind of technology to make the game feel a little bit better, you can take a look into that video, which is available on YouTube. And then another recent example that I have that is using tweening is I made this recent video on the Mario Party gameplay. And just to convey the action of interacting with the die and the way it reacts to how a player is animating and choosing and sorting a random number, you can see that it's, I was just waiting for it to loop. You can see that there's a lot there to convey that simple action. So it feels better, it gives more feedback in general. So that's easing curves. And easing curves can be even more powerful when you are smart about hierarchy. Now, most game engines have this, but the idea of a hierarchy is that you can start parenting objects to other objects. So in this case, you have a sphere that is a child here of an empty game object, which I'm calling pivot. And as you can see, the sphere has an offset here on the Z. Well, if you've been to Freya's talk, we can talk about what is Z forever. But Unity, Z is forward. And you're adding here too? I don't want to get there. It's too complex for my brain. But anyways, with this very simple setup, what ends up happening is that the pivot, when you rotate it, you can see it's rotating on the y-axis. But what happens with the child game object, the sphere, is that it's not changing. All it has is the offset of 2 on the z-axis. So when you think about this and you use this smartly, you can start building really interesting gameplay and visual things that you can start implementing by being smart. It's not about like implementing logics which you have to reference different things. It's about being smart about hierarchy. So you could potentially build gameplay situations in which you're rotating the pivot with keyboard, and maybe you're pressing a spacebar to change the position. In terms of gameplay code, you're decoupling here because all you're doing is that you're separating one rotation for the parent and the other action, which all you need to do is change one value from, from 2 to -2 in this case. And when I say that this combined with tweening is extremely powerful, is because then, because of this linear motion that is happening here, one thing that I can do with it is ease it. So this is an example of easing the movement and also the scale. And with DoTween, and that's why I'm trying to convince you specifically with DoTween, this is 2 lines of code. I'm changing the local position of that child object, and I'm just changing the z value specifically because that's all I need. Again, it's parented to that pivot. All I need to do is change one value. And I'm easing with the outback curve that I mentioned previously. And specifically with DoTween, there's this function called punch scale. So you're just like literally punching the scale, which is a great excuse for when your game is not great. Just add do punch scale to make everything look awesome. Trust me. And another really interesting thing about hierarchy is that you can also do all sorts of types of movement with it. So instead of saying sphere, move to these slots or these positions above the cylinders, what you can do essentially with hierarchy is that you can reparent your sphere. Maybe you can see it because it's a little bit hard to see, but the sphere is being reparented to the other slots. And then once it's reparented, that offset position, all you need to do is say, okay, now go to 0 because you are moving on local position. And the really interesting thing about this setup is that you can mess around. You can rotate those slots. You can change them to position, because you're depending on the logic of reparenting, it will always just try to go to 0. So you're building a little bit like a smarter way to make things move, to make things slot, which are common things that you have to do in a game. So I think this is a really powerful thing, especially with games that, for example, Balatro is another example, in which cards always rely on a slot they need to go. And essentially what you could do is that in your code, you can always just say, actually, your parent is this one now, so every time I just need you to go back and I release the card, maybe it just goes back to that one point by setting the position to 0. Boom. So this is another interesting way to think about this. In the Mix and Jam channel, there's an example in which I use this in many ways. As soon as the player interacts with the star, I reparent the player to the star center, and then I can say go to 0, and the character goes there into the 0. And the same thing here for the star, because the star has 2 kind of elements. And as you can see, the big star, and I'm going to call them big star and tiny star, the tiny star pulls back. And literally, it's very similar to that previous example that we were looking, because all I need to do is pull it back on the local Z position, and I can tween it to make it look like a slingshot. So in this case, to add more game feel, then it releases, and you have your interaction that looks a little bit more interesting. And now water break. Here's a picture of my puppy. Can I drink this water? Yeah? Cool. His name is Cusco, by the way. I keep telling people it's because of the city Cusco, but really it's because of the animated TV show, The Emperor. I don't want to get into this, but. Cool. I hope you are all convinced about easing curves, tweening, and a little bit of hierarchy. Now, of course, a lot of Game Jam games are 3D, a lot of Game Jam games are 2D. Specifically when you're thinking about 3D, one thing that makes your game stand out, and this is something that you have to think, you're using Godot, you're using Unity, you're using Unreal. All of these engines will have a default setting for lighting. They'll have a default setup for essentially the first scene that you're going to open. So it's very important to think about lighting. If you're trying to make your game stand out, you kind of have to think about it a little bit. So we've been looking at the sphere in some of the examples of the presentation. And it looks okay, I guess. But the reason it kind of looks the way it's being rendered right now is because, specifically on Unity, usually your objects and your environment is being set by this little value here called environment lighting. And the source of the environment lighting usually is the skybox by default. So that's why when we do not touch this at all, a lot of Unity games will look the same, a lot of Godot games will look the same if we don't touch these things at all. So it's very important for you to play with this, try this out a little bit. So if you change that drop box from skybox to something like gradient, then you can start playing around. This is a more artistic approach that you can have in terms of how your objects are interacting. And remember, I'm not talking here about baking and thinking about more complex situations. I'm talking about quick tips. So specifically with Unity, try this one out, gradient. It will give you interesting results. And it can give you even more interesting results if your environment has some sort of color palette. Let's say you have a ground that is blue. Then you can start using that gradient environment lighting to start simulating bounce lighting, essentially for free, right? You can start tweaking these values around and get a good sense of what makes it look better. So you could take a scene that looks like this, usually, let's again, say that you're making an isometric games only with shapes because you don't have a 3D artist or something like that. And then this is how it would look by default. And this is how you could make it look, which just makes it pop a little bit more with a few settings. So just for comparison, these are like the two things side by side. And I think that the one in the right looks more interesting. And of course, it's easy to do that bounce lighting because the ground has one solid color. But in a lot of Game Jam games, it could be the case that you only have one type of ground color or terrain type. This is a technique that I used a lot in this game, which is called Hey Listen, that I made, because all the models in the game are pretty simple. They're like vertex lit, and they're simple models, and there's nothing complex going on. But the reason why, with the camera the way it is set up, the reason why it looks interesting, it's a smart combination about fake lights and the lighting that I'm simulating, because the game is mostly blue. And of course, you could change these values, but it's an easy way to get your game just like a little bit more interesting. And because it is, when you're talking about 3D, lighting, of course, will be an important factor. Now, the next thing I'm gonna talk about are events. So events, it's something that will help you guys along the run, for example, in the development of the jam. Say you don't have time to think about exactly what we've been talking about, which is making your game stand out. You don't have time to think about it now, but you do want to prepare for the future. Let's say you leave the polishing part to the last day, which is perfectly fine. But there is a way to sort of like think about this to future-proof what you're doing. I usually set up my logic by doing this. I have, again, hierarchy. I have the basic player game object, which usually is just an empty game object. And then I decouple everything from visuals as a child game object. I have visuals. And what I usually do is that I have whatever game logic script, like player controller in this case, attached to player, and then I have visuals as a completely separate script. And then, if you go into the player controller, this is what I usually do. If you are building your logic and you don't want to think about this now, you're just like typing down your logic, you want it to be structured or whatever way you code, make sure that you always have an event that is being triggered. In Unity, it could be Unity events or actions. In Unreal, it could be the custom events and those signals. But if you're just typing your code and you want to future-proof to make iteration faster in terms when it comes to polishing your game, make sure you add events on move, on jump, on slot, on unslot, all these different kind of things. Because then when it comes time to, okay, let's polish our game. Let's, I don't know, prepare it a little bit better for the final cycle. Then, on that visual script, all you need to do is to listen to those events. So, by doing this, you're doing multiple things. You're organizing your script in a way that I think is pretty great, but you're also allowing yourself to make more scrappy code on the visuals. Because visuals, at the end of the day, are very experimental. You will have to adjust based on the experience that you want to convey. So, in this case, I'm just like, okay, when that sphere moves, I'm changing the color of the emission and I'm blinking the color. You can see it's a pretty long and complex thing that for people that understand Dween. But in this kind of code, I allow myself to just be more experimental because I'm trying out visuals. And again, this is great because it's completely separated from logic. So this will happen every time I move. And whatever is happening on move, let it happen. And this is separate. So this works for visuals, but it also works for sound, for example. So of course, when you're at the very last stage of polishing and you also want to add sounds, all you need to do, listen to that event as well. So this is what it looks like in the practical example. I'm rotating, and every time I move, that's the line of code I wrote. I'm listening to every time you do that twist with the tweening, with the hierarchy that we just talked about, and I'm just blinking the emission color. Completely separated, right? Another thing that is important for people working in games that have mouse, as I mentioned previously, you could build events for your pointers, right? So you have onHover as an event, and you can have that as a Boolean event, which expects true or false. So for those of you working with games with pointers and mouse, it's really important to, again, feedback, give players an understanding of what's going on. So what I usually do is focus on the game logic, and then prepare these events along my code. Just let it there. And then when I'm ready to polish, then I can do things like this, which the visuals are just listening to it and waiting for the game to give them outlines. And of course, just to mention, I think it's important to mention, in this specific case, I'm using this tool, which is actually pretty incredible. I found out about this 2 months ago, I think. It's a pretty cool outline asset. And since we're talking about outlines now, that's actually another cool way to make your game stand out. Because outlines, by definition, are making an object stand out. You are putting a separation between rest and the object. So do consider getting a tool, a plugin, or something that's ready to go that can add outlines to your game. Like, that's an interesting way to take the 3D look and make it a little bit more interesting. So why not try adding outlines to your game? Now, this is where I think it's the sort of like line between simple tricks, because I don't want to go beyond that too much. Again, we need to be realistic. It's a game jam. You know, time varies. But if you do have time, of course, you could always look into particles, light emissions, screen shakes, hit stops, the classics of game feel. And I have this example here of essentially game logic that is just using transformation values. You're just detecting movement. It's pretty simple. But if you do have time to implement everything that I've kind of been showing so far, is that you will be able to transform something like this into hopefully something like this. And I know, of course, I have a lot of time and experience using Unity specifically, but trust me, this is not maybe as hard as it seems. There's just a lot of feedback. And again, it's not really about looking cool, even though it kind of looks cool, but it's about the fact that the more information being provided here in this particular demo, the better it feels. So it doesn't need to be blink emission, it doesn't need to have post-processing, for example, but it's about conveying information. So think about those kind of things when you're building your game. And this particular demo is in a project I'm working to teach more about game feel, so I'll talk more about that in the future on socials or whatever. But do keep that in mind. And if you've been paying attention, try to think about all the things that I just mentioned and try to connect them with what you're seeing, right? For example, the rotation that the enemy is leaning to and being punched to, it's all done by hierarchy, because the game logic of the enemy is just a collider. But I separated into a child the visuals, like I mentioned previously. So I can do whatever I want with these visuals and not interfere into game logic. So all of this is using events that I'm listening to and experimenting with the visuals of how to make the game feel better and how to give more feedback to the player. Whew. All right. Identity. What do I mean by identity? So usually when you participate in a game jam, what happens is at the end of the day, you get a submission screen or something like this, right? There's a bunch of games. There's so many. It's very overwhelming. So standing out so far, I've been talking about the gameplay, the game feel, the visual, the identity, and all these reactions and feedbacks. But I actually believe that you also should be considering how does your game stand out from a visual standpoint, even on this thumbnail phase, let's call it like that. Because this will happen. There's a lot of options. And like I mentioned at the very start, you do want more players clicking on your game. So not only does your trailer or the way your game looks have to look interesting, but also this kind of space as well. So my key tip here is take the elements of your game and extract the PNGs, as I'm going to call them. Just extract them. Whatever you have, logo, widgets, banners, key art, if you do have key art, or sprites. Just separate those, because what this will allow you to do is essentially to have an iteration moment where you can think about the banner arts, and you can think about these key images in a way that is not really destructive. You're just moving these PNGs around and you're trying to figure out what looks best and what brings more attention. So of course, when I was in the process of making this for itch, I was like, okay, there's this image, so I'm gonna do this like this. There's the logo, so maybe I could export it as a separate PNG so that on the top part of the game page, I can just use the logo with the PNG and that works. So I think that this is very important because at the end of the day, you want more players to click on it. And I know that this is a little bit about marketing, but I actually think that every game developer could benefit from just thinking a little bit more about how does your game look on that sea of 1,000 Game Jam games that are happening. And, you know, of course, it's important to think about this. And since I talked about the trailers, I also need to talk about trailers. And this one might be a huge nitpick. And I'll explain you why. Particularly, on my own opinion, I think there's nothing worse than looking at a game trailer that's trying to like sort of sell me the idea of what's going on and the main interactions, and just listening to the music track on top of the game. And the reason why that happens usually is people will record footage of the final game that has music and sound effects. You have to record that all, and then someone's going to do a trailer on top of it. And of course, you want to be able to cut these different pieces of footage to show different parts of your game. But what ends up happening is that now you have the music from the footage being cut, so people just replace the entire trailer with the music. So it's just footage, music. As I said, nitpick? Maybe. But I actually do not love when the trailer cuts out the SFX that someone worked out. And I actually think that trailers that convey and give attention to the sound effects are a lot better. So my biggest tip is when you are recording your game footage, record only with sound effects. Obviously, if you have time to do so. But in all the engines, there's a simple way to do this with audio mixers or separators. It's just something very important to keep in mind because you could just record your footage like this. And let's see if sound's going to work. Yeah, it's slow, but you get it. Is there maybe a way to turn it on? No.
The mic and the micros.
Oh, okay. So this is an example of the previous game I mentioned, only with the sound effects. And you can see the footage is just simple cuts. Cut, 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 cut. And what this allows you to do is to get a result like this, which it's pretty low to hear, but so, again, I'm very aware that it is a nitpick, but I do think, in my personal experience, that conveys a better experience, and it conveys that you're paying attention and you want to show the players that everything that you put in your game, including the sound effects, are extremely important to the core experience. And again, this trailer wasn't hard to make because it's all footage directly that I used as like the game footage, but only with sound effects with the music layered on top. So you can get really interesting results, and this is using the same philosophy as the PNGs. You're just separating the layers of what your game provides, and you can work in a non-destructive way, which will allow you to iterate fast and get good results, and hopefully get a good game trailer. Okay, so what's the conclusion here of this presentation? Standing out, as I mentioned, and it's the theme of this talk, is not about the perfection. It's not about making the best visuals on the Game Jam. You're here to learn, you're here to have fun, you're here to experiment. So remember that. Standing out is about making sure that you're thinking about how does your game look in the ocean of the other games. The other conclusion is you should polish, but polish smart, not hard. Of course, you could polish by baking lights. You can polish by making your custom 3D model. You can polish by implementing a shader. Or you could polish by using simple tricks. So by using simple tricks, you will be able to get good results, but in a faster way that is more realistic into a game jam game scope. Game scope? A scope. And at the end, like I mentioned, give a little bit of love to your game's identity. Why not, right? You spend all the time of the weekend of the jam putting your love into this game and coding and doing animation and shading maybe, all these different things. So since we're almost at the finish round, why not just put a little bit more effort? And as I said, this will give you more output. It will either become a great portfolio piece, or it will actually bring more players to play your game, and you will get more feedback, and hopefully in this long run, you will become a better game developer, designer, because you will understand more about the process of making, but also publishing, sharing, bringing it to the world. And that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much.